The talk is on wide row canola, and I guess the first question that people tend to ask me is why bother doing more work on row spacing in canola. So I'll try and answer that question as I go through. Before I start, I should point out that I'm presenting on behalf of a number of people here. So this work was done by myself, Mark Seymour, Chris Pinkney from Agrarian, and some growers from the Northern Agri Group. So Ben, Rowan and Carl are growers in the Northern Agri Group. So thanks to all of those people for doing these trials. So why bother? Well, I guess the first thing is we see from the Bank West benchmarks that the area of canola grown in the low rainfall area is increasing, so the proportion of the farm that's been sown to canola in those low rainfall areas is increasing, and it has done over the last 7 or 8 years quite dramatically. If we look at CBH data from 2013, we see that about 19% of the area that was put into canola in that year was put in the low rainfall zone. Also in 2013, a good year for most, we had about a quarter of the production at a level that was less than 1.5 tonnes per hectare. So we've got a fair area of canola that's in the low rainfall zone where we need to make sure that our input costs are reasonably low. The other reason for doing the trial work is that the people I mentioned before were quite interested in the work, and some of those people have been sowing lupins in wide rows for quite a few years, and we're interested to see if it would work with canola. So it works with lupins. We've done quite a bit of research, and I'll go through some of that a bit later. Reduced inputs, as I mentioned, particularly seed costs with the amount of hybrid seed that's being sown, and potentially some fertiliser savings as well. And a major thing for these low rainfall farmers is the yield stability in dry years. So that was one of the things that we found in lupins that I'll explain. There may also be some practical advantages. So the farmers have sort of said to me that it's easier to manage your stubble with wide rows. It's also, there's some savings in fuel costs at seeding, and they're able to put on reasonably good rates of soil incorporated herbicides with some good level of safety. So there's also some practical applications. So what did we find with lupins? From about 2002 through to about 2006, we did quite a bit of work on row spacing with lupins. This is some data from one of Bob French's trials at Merredin. It's a nice little set of data here which pretty much what it shows you is that plants in wider row spacings had less moisture stress at the flowering and early podding stage. So Bob measured the water potential in the leaves of plants grown in different row spacings. And you can see at this time of the year when we've got a need for moisture for obviously flowering and early podding, in the wide rows there was less stress in the leaves. The reason that happens is because in wide rows it takes a longer time for the plants to establish leaf area index or a high level of leaf area index. So they're receiving less radiation and the crops are generally less bulky. So with the wider row crops, they're generally less bulky and using less moisture during the winter period. The other impact of the wide rows is that because you have the plants separated further apart, the roots take some time to explore the soil, and in effect that rations out the water that's between those rows of crop so that the roots are accessing the water later on in the year. And we clearly showed that was the case from quite a few trials up at Mullewa. So that's, I guess, one reason why lupins worked. Bob also looked at a series of trials where he put lupins in different row spacings in different sites. You can see here, the main thing is that Mullewa, we were able to go from 25 centimetres through to even a metre row spacing without dramatic losses in yield. And we were able to sow either in late April or early May without row spacing, with the same influence of row spacing, basically. If you go down to Newdigate, which is a lot colder sort of climate, the situation was completely different. Where we sowed lupins in row spacings that were wider than 25 centimetres, so these ones here, we had a yield decline, and it didn't matter whether we sowed them early or late, that response was the same. So sowing lupins in wide rows didn't work in those colder environments, and that was associated, well, the reason for that was because they weren't able to compensate for being sown in wide rows, so they didn't generate the biomass that was needed to produce the yields that we were getting. So the recommendations from all that work was really that growing lupins in wide rows, and I should say here we were talking about 50 centimetre rows, was considered okay, but we only recommended it for the northern regions. Going on to the canola trials, so with all of that behind us, we thought it would be a good idea to try some of these things with canola. 6 trials last year, 3 farmer-sown trials. There were 2 different row spacings. They were either, well, for the farmer-sown ones, they were 25 and 50 centimetres or 30 and 60 centimetres. 2 varieties, an OP and a hybrid, 2 different seeding rates, and for 2 of the trials there were 3 replications. For one of the farmer trials we didn't have enough room in the paddock and we just put in the 1 run of each of the treatments. So as you see it there, each of these runs is a variety by a row spacing, and it was split across for high or low seeding rate, and that was all fully randomised within the treatment design. There were also 3 small plot trials that went alongside these large ones, so they were in the same paddock, just adjacent to these. And they had the same treatments that I just mentioned, but we also put in fungicide application or adjusted the fertiliser rates depending on what the farmer was interested in looking at. This is where we are, so Geraldton here, you're probably 70, 80 k's north of Geraldton, so we really are in the north of the northern region where we would expect this type of agronomy to have the best chance of working. We tried to get the sites on roughly the same latitude and go from a high to low rainfall area just to see if, just out of interest really. This is the trial at Ben Cripps's place, 9th of September. So large plots. You can see there high density, narrow row spacing. Starting to feel the pinch a bit. You've got a lower seeding rate with the wide row spacing there. The conditions at the site, we had a very good establishment with very good rainfall in late April and May, but very little rainfall over the winter period and some very hot days in August, so well above 30 degrees in August. I went out and measured the moisture between the rows, both between the rows in the wide and in the narrow, and there was more water between the rows at that stage with the wide row treatment, which is quite important at this stage because if you are getting those high temperatures at flowering, heat stress can be a major problem, and if you have more moisture in the soil, the plant has more capacity to deal with that heat stress and reduce the amount of seeds that are bought. So it's not just for seed fill, but it's also for making sure that we get a reasonable amount of the seed production on the plants. Looking at the plants themselves, the graph here just shows the weight of a single plant. We just took biomass cuts like we would normally do and counted the number of plants that we cut, and I converted those to an average plant weight. What you can see there is that when the plants were put in wider rows, they exploited the extra moisture, nutrients and sunlight that they had access to and grew into bigger plants, which is not surprising. Hybrids had more of a response than the OPs. When we look at, I guess, how the canola plant grows, it's pretty obvious that it's quite adaptable and will respond to plant density. So again, these are some plants, residues that I dug out of some of Bob's seeding density trials. So we've got here, I think that's out of about an 80 plant per square metre treatment. That's out of about a 5 plant per square metre treatment. And clearly, canola has the capacity to branch out and a reasonable sort of plant architecture for wide row spacings. Looking at yield, this is from Ben Cripps's place, one of the trials that Chris Pinkney helped set up, and it's got a really low CV percentage. This is all yield monitor results, and it's just one of those trials where you're sitting on the header and the yield monitor results are just giving you exactly what you saw in the paddock for the year. So I'm really confident that this trial is giving us some good results. The main point is that with the low seeding rate in wide rows, we had reasonable yield. The other factors there were that the hybrids yielded more, and that with the OPs we did have a response to seeding rate, but the main point out of the slide is really that we hadn't pushed it to the limit yet. We don't know how low we could have gone within those wide rows without dropping yield off. If we look at the other trials of the replicated trials, one yielded more in wide rows than narrow, 3 were the same, and in one trial there was a greater yield in the narrow rows than the wide rows. At 3 of the 5 replicated sites, the wide row by the low seed rate combination was the best combination for yield. So this is Ben Cripps in his paddock. He sowed his whole program on 60 centimetre row spacings based on some work he's done previously looking at comparisons between the different row spacings. One other thing that's interesting to look at is the efficiency of establishment. We've got more hybrid seed going out there, so particularly in the northern region where herbicide resistance to the Group A's and the Group C's are an emerging issue. People are using Roundup Readies quite often, so 46% in the Geraldton Port Zone. And so we want to be maximising the amount of seed that actually gets out of the ground. What we found was, if you look at the narrow row spacing by the lower seeding rate or the lower target density, 84% of the seed that went in the ground actually came up as a plant. So that was very good. As I said, we had excellent opening rains in April and May, and the establishment rates were actually a lot higher than we had estimated. On the flip side to that, you've got wider row spacings, higher plant densities. You're jamming a lot more plants into each metre of row, and of course that's causing competition between the plants, and we saw a lot of seedling mortality. So a low level of efficiency. So the question is, I guess, how low can we go in the wide rows to try and improve this target density, this efficiency of the seed, and without dropping our yields. Another point is that the way we're seeding the paddocks at the moment, when we talk about wide rows and in row cropping systems in other parts of the world, they tend to talk about the plants per metre of row, or the spacing between the plants, rather than the plants per square metre. If you look at what we're actually getting in our paddocks at the moment, it's a pretty uneven distribution along the length of the plot row, or the crop row. You've got small plants, big plants, so it's a bit all over the place. This was a major source of frustration when we were working with the lupins, trying to compare seed rate responses with row spacing responses, because you would get out there and measure your plots, and you would have, in the very low seeding rates, you would have large misses, large distances between plants, and then you would have a few plants jammed up together. So it was a real problem. And to get over that, in 2005, we got a precision planter, so a vacuum plate seeder, and compared lupins sown with this machine and a normal John Deere combine. What we found was we looked at the seeding rate, changed the seeding rate, and we did this with lupins. For the combine, you've pretty much got a flat response to seeding rate. The old recommendation for lupins was 100 kilos per hectare, but we could go, I guess, lower than that, and we didn't get a response with the combine. But with the precision seeder, we got a yield improvement when we reduced the yield, the seeding rate. So from that 100 kilo seeding rate through to the 70, we had a yield improvement, and there probably wasn't any real difference between these two treatments here, but the yield didn't drop off even at this low seeding rate.
5 minutes.
5, yeah, that's cool. So I guess going back to that picture that we saw with the plants in it with uneven distribution, perhaps we can sow our plants a little bit differently to get a better establishment. The work that we did in Mullewa was very similar to some work that's been done in Canada. These guys put in 16 trials, and the treatments included a set of treatments there where they were not uniform, so the plants in the row weren't spaced evenly apart, and treatments here where the plants in the row were spaced at even intervals apart. They did this by sowing the crop and then taking out plants. 2 sets of results, so we've got a high yield situation there, 6 trials, going from about, in the biggest increase, going from about 2.5 tonnes to 3. In the low rainfall situation, about that 1 tonne per hectare, which a lot of our low rainfall guys are working on, they had a large increase with that treatment. I guess you've got here the major response occurring at low plant densities. So it's more important to get even distribution of your seed if we're sowing seed at low densities. So when we go to chase our low seeding rates to get the best bang for our buck out of our expensive hybrid seed, uniform seeding rates are really going to be something we might need to look at. So to summarise, 50 to 60 centimetre yield rows yielded well enough in canola to consider them at these sites. Canola plants were able to compensate given the types of plants they are. We also probably should test this further south because canola plants are a lot more cold tolerant than lupins, so we might see a different response to those colder sites. And some of the work there is showing that we may be able to reduce the input costs using a wide row production package. And I think that's about all I've got.